When we think of the name, the five-letter household name that has become synonymous with dive watches, chronographs, actually wristwatches in general, we seldom think of the name ever being affiliated to dress watches. The furthest that the uninitiated may venture to guess would be towards a Datejust as the most formal watch that Rolex offers. But surprisingly to some, they do have a line of dress pieces, a line that is as discreet as the watches themselves, the Cellini line. Rolex Cellini pieces have never been bestsellers. They aren't popular amongst the masses. The question has been begged many times about why these pieces are still a part of the catalogue, and this discussion, I hope, will expand on the thinking. One brand that I like to look at often is Patek Philippe. They are known for their classically inspired dress pieces, like their high complications, annual calendars, and stunning chronographs. But amongst this line of luxurious dress watches lies the Nautilus and the Aquanaut, two watches that are so unlike the family in many ways. But these pieces, though so counter to Patek Philippe's design language and history, I'll even go so far to say that do not belong in the family, have become some of their greatest sellers and icons of the brand. This is for a few reasons. Love them or hate them, they are gorgeous watches. They have been approached by a designer and have been given a designer's touch, which of course makes them polarizing. But viewing them as a designer would, I find them to be stunning. But because the trend of buying and selling steel watches has become so popular, it was almost a shoo-in that these pieces, made by one of the best watchmakers in the world, would be highly sought after. The likes of social media has also perpetuated this trend of collecting these watches, and now steel is out of control. Now, where Patek has had success with these obscure pieces in their line, Rolex is experiencing the opposite. But they aren't fretting about it either. Steel Rolex pieces are as unobtainable as steel Patek pieces, and herein lies the difference. They are polar opposites. Where the core of Patek's line still relies on classically inspired dress pieces that aren't as popular as their steel pieces, Rolex is the opposite. And this essentially is the reason why they are able to keep their Cellini pieces in circulation. I'm not saying that Patek has anything to lose if they decided to remove their steel pieces, but Rolex removing their Cellini line wouldn't make a difference to their sales. They are not in competition with anyone else. I see the Cellini line of pieces as an example of Rolex portraying their ability to be fine watchmakers, not only being a brand that can create great sports watches that are rugged and dependable, but as a means for them to display their ability of creating watches with a more delicate touch that manage to rub shoulders with the likes of high horology pieces. So instead of going into the history of the line, one that is steeped in 80s greed is good, I will focus on the design of the new line of pieces that were reintroduced in 2014. In fact, I will link an excellent historical overview of the Cellini line done by Watchfinder in the description below. In front of you is the Patek Philippe Calatrava, the Lange Sohne Saxonia, and the Breguet Classique. All of these watches are sublime. Three of the most powerful dress watches in the world, and most would say that these are all the epitome of what makes a superlative dress watch. I will link to an old video of mine that discusses the designs of these pieces at length that I'm sure you will enjoy. So briefly running through them, the Calatrava is such an icon, an example of simplicity and excellence in the dress watch sphere. The 5196 in my eyes is remarkable because it calls back to the original reference 96 Calatrava, but adds a few touches that makes the piece all the more modern. It seems plain and spare of detail, but the beauty is in the small details, like the polishing of the batons, the attention to the size and proportion of the watch case relative to the width of the watch's lugs. Though the design seems boring to many, this watch and its predecessors are some of the core establishers of the modern Swiss dress watch. Then jumping across the border to Glashütte, the Lange Sohne Saxonia, an archetypal piece of German watchmaking. And I love comparing this watch to Swiss pieces because you can just sit back and say it's German, and then everything about it makes sense. Plain, simple, so spare of decoration, but at its heart, it's an absolute powerhouse. Now this piece again is timeless in its design, simply because there is as little design as possible to the piece. Straight batons, beautiful alpha hands, and there you go. Tell the time. But this basic foundation has been used time and time again, to a point now where it has sadly lost its originality. Regardless, even if you don't want to admit it publicly, everyone wants to own a Lange deep down. And who can blame you? Finally, one of the greatest watch pioneers, Breguet and the Classique. This piece is steeped in traditional motifs, and it says a lot about a brand that stays so close and true to its heritage. Gorgeous allocation of dial space, and the use of dial guilloche. And just to think that Breguet pretty much hallmarked the coin-edged case, the Breguet handset, the Breguet numerals. Frankly, this watch and the name is more important to the existence of watchmaking than any other. So with the pieces back in the frame again, the point I want to hammer home is that these three pieces, though very different, are also very similar. They trade elements between each other. They all have their own place as being some of the best dress watches in the world, but their DNA has been extrapolated, some might even say bastardized, to a point where their origins have been lost to the layperson. Though they are all unique in their own way, there are rare exceptions of originality, and the reality is that originality is hard to come by. Originality when it comes to creating a line of dress watches is doubly difficult, because the attention needs to be focused on sparsity, and all the while savouring the details. Instead of being flamboyant or excessive, the pieces need to exercise restraint. The truest traditional dress watches are pieces that shouldn't even have seconds hands on their dials. That level of restraint. And here's the thing. Rolex, a brand that has a great history with dress watches in the last century, has not only been able to create a new line of dress watches that is theirs, but a line that manages to amalgamate traditional with modern in a way that no other brand has done before. The Rolex creative portfolio is vast. One only needs to look at their bubbleback line from between the 1930s and the 1950s. These pieces offer so much variety in themselves. The layout of their numerals, the proportions of their cases, the styling of their hands. And then looking at some of their most iconic pieces from the 30s and 40s, these watches are just beautiful. If you need a good reference, I will also link to Hodinkey's famed Talking Watches episode with John Goldberger, where his vintage pieces are discussed at length. What is fascinating is that these watches all play a part in the development of the modern Cellini line. Imagine how much source material the design team could pin up on the wall in their studios. The simplest model in their line is the Cellini Time, a basic, no-nonsense dress watch. The models are separated by their dials, one being white, another being black. But there is so much more to these dials. The earlier models, those originally unveiled at Baselworld in 2014, uses a combination of stick batons and Roman numerals. A very elegant approach, and from a distance the watch seems fairly plain, but how they have differentiated themselves with their dial architecture is a stroke of genius. Panning the focus towards the batons, the minute track has been centered between the two segments of the batons, and neatly placed inside are the Arabic numerals denoting the minutes of each marker. This element is by far my most favorite aspect of the watch. It is so basic, almost obvious, but at the same time has not been integrated into popular pieces today. The fact that the numerals at the quarters have been stretched and elongated to match the overall length of the batons is also a nice touch. It makes the layout very clean and concise. And another important element to highlight is that the dial utilizes its space well. Believe it or not, many dials suffer from not being able to exercise a good use of space. And to further explain, let's look at the rule of thirds. Notice where the minute track is. It has not been fully pushed to the back of the dial, but it also hasn't been centered on the dial either. If we were to measure the area of the space on the outside of the dial and compare it to the interior space highlighted in this diagram, you can see that the interior space equals about 2/3 of the overall dial surface area. This watch understands how to use the rule of thirds correctly, and it is all the better for it. The layout has been approached by adding elongated numerals that use up a larger portion of the dial, but since they are thin batons, they do not overemphasize or overpower it. The hands are also perfectly spaced, allowing for the hour hand to just reach the base of the lower baton, while the minute hand reaches the lower portion of the top baton. This is an incredible, incredible dial design, and I'm not just saying that because it's a Rolex. I mean more power to them that it is in fact a Rolex. A watch company that is praised for their sports watches, who are now able to pull something off like this, it just goes to show that when they commit to something, they truly can commit. The proportions, the sizes, the space, and the rule of thirds all play to the watch's strengths, and I guarantee that it took a long time for the team to finalize their ideas on the final result. As you would have seen by now, the more updated pieces now utilize batons all the way around the dial, and I find this to be a much more appealing look overall. The symmetry is just balanced out all the more. And then looking at the other variants, we have a date complication, known as the Cellini date, which has been added to the right-hand side of the dial. Keeping with traditional fashion, it has a wheel instead of a window, and again it works very well. And the guilloche on these dials, the funny thing is, it reminds me of the pattern of a scalloped seashell. Somehow I don't think that was an accident. Some other notable models come with moonphase complications, and others with jewel times, but the true highlight of the line, I feel, is found with their most basic pieces. Turning now to the cases, they are slim, elegant in profile, and look very similar to oyster cases at first glance. Wouldn't you believe, but these pieces come with screw-down crowns and 50 meters of water resistance. Sadly, the case back does not have a sapphire back, but a solid back does aid in water resistance. And finally, looking at one more element that I believe has been so elegantly approached is the relationship between the crown and the bezel. Engine-turned bezels are a thing of the past. It is very old-fashioned when looking at modern dress watches. So to remove the emphasis on the turning, the front of the bezel is slightly domed, while the other half is turned. But the teeth are barely noticeable, and it is a really nice touch. Then being paired with the crown that pays homage to vintage pieces as well, like the bubble backs and the older generation of dress pieces. This texture pairs so well together. And then the dial, with a similar pattern. I admit it does look fairly overkill, but you can't blame the texture for being the problem. If anything, the parts do correspond with one another, but the combination looks too overused. What then makes the modern Rolex Cellini line so interesting? If not anything else, it was an experiment by Rolex to see if they could create a modern dress watch. There was no need for them to produce pieces like these. At this point in time, they are sitting very comfortably as being a name that everyone knows. But what resulted was a watch that not only paid homage to decades of forgotten dress pieces of the past, but also can be seen as a reimagining of an entirely new line of dress watches. Yes, they do not correspond with the image of how people view modern Rolex today, but they are original, and originality today is hard to come by. The resulting watch manages to be all of these things. Simple, eye-catching, I wouldn't go so far to say understated, but elegant. It oozes elegance. Here's the thing. Would any of us be interested in choosing one of these pieces over the likes of a Patek Philippe or a Lange if the opportunity presented itself? That is an interesting question. On one hand, you are buying into two companies that primarily deal with dress watches, so that must mean that their expertise in the area outweighs others. On the other hand, as we have seen time and time again, Rolex always manages to create excellent machines, overpriced but excellent performing machines. And this experiment of reintroducing a new dress line could have been their attempt of marketplace capitalization. Domination in this area might have been a stretch, but the resulting watch is a gem, and well worth the crown. And then finally, the notion of being spotted wearing a piece like this, and then subsequently being asked, "What watch is that?" You replying Rolex would undoubtedly turn heads, because as we all know now, modern Rolex don't make dress watches, do they?